All right, we are coming at you with another competitive list breakdown today. Another one that I've come up with for the Starshatter Arsenal Grotmas detachment that just came out. So, definitely super excited to get this list on the table later this week. I am doing a teams practice on Wednesday with the other list mentioned in the previous episode, but I do want to try this one later this week because I think it has the potential to be even better. And spoiler alert, it has no doomsday arks. So let's get into this. Let me talk about it a little further here. So I figured it'd be easier to have the layout up or just like something to kind of explain my thought process on the list. So from the previous list, character-wise, nothing changes. I think you have to run the staple of the 2 hex marks. One hex mark is going to have the -1 damage enhancement, which is hanging out over here, and he's just going to hang around the king, depending on the layout and the matchup. And then you're going to have another hex mark just on your home field objective with Imhotech is a great, I think, home field package that's effective, especially because the hex mark is such an efficient Overwatch and AP2 ignores cover. He's good at getting rid of like Aquilons. He's good at Inceptors, kind of, but just something that your opponent has to respect. And you have 2 separate units on the objective, and they only get 1 activation, so they can kill one of them. And they can't charge, so a lot of times it's still going to help you save and keep the point. And Imhotech is just there to obviously farm that CP because, spoiler alert, all the strats are super good in this detachment. So Silent King, I think, is going to be mandatory. I'm sure, as you guys have heard on YouTube right now, he's more or less unkillable. He can be killed, but in his current state right now, unless they change like the -1 damage to exclude the Silent King or points adjustments, something, he is just a brick. So he's just got to stay in the list. He solves a lot of the problems as well in terms of like he is a really great damage piece. He's a damage sponge. And the most important thing is he's something, he gives the list an anchor piece. So, if you think about Warhammer, and I'm assuming if you're watching this, like you probably play a lot of games where, more or less you're trying to for sure figure out, okay, how can I lock in these 2 objectives and how can I harass these other 2, right? So if you don't have the Silent King in the list, you have Stalkers as an option. They're durable, they're OC4, but they're still pretty easy to kill. You could put Race in the list, but they don't really synergize with the detachment because there's no way to give them -1 to wound. You can't do the react strat with them, and you can't do the -1 damage either. So really the only other option that I could come up with is like if you're running the 6 Locust Destroyer brick with the Locust Lord, and he has like a res orb, so maybe on an activation they kill like half the unit, but then you can just react move behind a wall or something, and potentially save the unit because you have like a screening piece in front of them. But other than that, there's not really much outside of the king that's going to be holding down points other than the king himself. So he really fulfills that role, I think, in the perfect manner, and he just cannot leave the list. So what we changed here, going down the list, we still have a Reanimator. We still have Death Marks. We still have a unit of Flayed Ones. And we are going to swap out the Doomsday Arks for a Locust Destroyer. Great utility piece. You could potentially have him on the board in the early game. Or you can just keep him in reserve, and he's just a great like behind enemy lines piece. Drop him in for containment. Engage in all fronts if it's towards like the late game. There's a lot of good options for 35 points that you can use him for. They're extremely efficient. So then we're going to move on to the Locust Heavy Destroyers. So we have a unit of 2 for the Amidics, which are the anti-infantry guns, and I think they are just lights out in this detachment. They don't need a Locust Lord. They are just so efficient by themselves. I think they're an auto include. And then we also leaned in because we are taking out the Doomsday Arks. We do need to fulfill the list with a little bit more in terms of anti-tank or replacing that anti-tank that we lost. So I like putting in just another unit of 3 heavy destroyers. And my thought process on this was that unit has guaranteed it's going to get 3 attacks, and it synergizes a little bit better with the +1 to wound strat, where you can, essentially have that unit hit on 2s if they're on an objective, and then +1 to wound. They're going to be wounding anything in the game on 2s, which is just crazy, pending any minuses that the unit may have. So they're extremely efficient. And then another unit of 3 Amitic heavy destroyers, anti-infantry guns, because I think they're just so good. Like with that +1 to wound strat, you're wounding pretty much all vehicles in the game on 4s. Granted, it's AP1, but with the stalkers, you can give them ignore cover, so they're more or less like AP2. It's just extremely efficient. And then what I wanted to lean more into was Scorpekh, because I think the more that I think about it, they are could be so good in this detachment. I think when you're thinking of a play style, let's just say we're on Crucible or Battle Layout 1. These Scorpeks with a move of 8 are extremely efficient at interacting with the center field objective. Not so much on the your opponent's natural expansion, depending on the mission. You need something with a little bit more movement, like 10 or 12, ideally, to interact with this effectively. Unless your opponent is really pushing up, then it opens the door for that. But mainly with the Scorpeks, in this detachment, having a 90-point unit that has 12 attacks, hitting on 2s on an objective, rerolling hits on the charge, strength 7, which you're wounding pretty much anything in the game on 3s, that they're going to hit outside of vehicles, and then giving them the +1 to wound strat, dev wounds for 90 points is just crazy. Like, for 90 points, they are just going to clean up anything that they hit. And then putting in perspective, you just take a Chaos Knight on an objective. If they connect on the charge, average, they're going to get 12 hits through. You give them the +1 to wound strat, they're wounding on 4s. You theoretically probably get 5 to 6 wounds through, or 5 to 6 wounds through. Maybe 1 or 2 of those is a dev wound. So, you could expect, if they pop off, they could probably minimum, they're doing 6 damage to a knight. On average, it's probably 8 to 10. For a 90-point unit is just crazy. So I want to lean into that, see how it plays. So we're bringing 3 units of 3. And essentially it allows you to have 1 unit potentially over here as a behind-the-wall screen piece. And a support for the Silent King. So depending on how fast you move up, if you auto-advance, let's say the King 14 inches first turn, you move up the Stalker to form a move block. Whatever units are coming up, they're going to kill this Stalker. They can interact with the Silent King. They're probably not going to kill him, and then it gives you a much more efficient, I feel clapback with the Scorpeks coming up. Cleaning up this resources, and not to mention the Silent King shooting and his combat, because none of his weapons are blast. So he's going to be able to fire everything, which is super good as well. It's just insane. And he's still hitting on 2s, because the opponent on the objective, he's going to be -1 hit because he's in combat, but he's +1 hit because you're on an objective. It's just crazy. So I want to try out 3 Scorpeks, basically 1 station behind the King, 1 stage up here, 1 stage up here, just to give you some options. And then going into the last part of the list, we're going to finish it out with 2 Tombblade units again and 2 Stalkers. And like I talked about in the previous list, I think these are going to be a staple just because the Stalkers give you the ability to interact with your opponent's natural expansion turn 1 if you need to. Same thing with the Tombblades. The Tombblades are great having 1 unit on the board, 1 unit in ingress, potentially to ingress on, and then you can get them pretty much anywhere on the board the next turn because you can spend either a CP to have them go through a wall, you can spend a CP for them to flat 6 advance, and they fire and fade. So, if you really needed them, they can go 24 inches in 1 turn. So it's pretty crazy the utility you get out of them. The only downside is that they are Only T5 with a 4-up save. So the Overwatch threat is definitely a problem with them. So it's definitely something you have to watch out for with that unit. And that is where the Stalkers, I think, really come into play because they basically, I mean, they can get Overwatch, but you're not really going to do much to them because they're vehicles. So it definitely gives you some play if you're going second to deny your opponent's primary going into their turn 2, which I think the Stalkers really solved that problem pretty well. So the only other tweak that I could see on this list that I did want to talk about is I'm not running any of the regular Locust Destroyers outside of just that unit of 1 for a utility piece. But one option that you could do that I also want to try as well is you could drop 1 unit of Heavy Destroyers for the 165, probably the Emetics, and you bring a unit of 6 regular Destroyers, and then you break the Deathmark unit down into another Locust Destroyer. And that will create like the net difference in points, and I think you come out at like 1990 or maybe 1995. That's also a really good option as well. I think the 6 Locust Destroyers definitely have some play in this detachment. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the AP2, Flat 2, I think where it gets tough is I think their utility really shines when you bring the Locust Lord in there, and at that point it gets kind of expensive. I mean, for what they do, it is really good, but I think it's at like 2, because you probably have to run like the ignore cover enhancement. So at that point, that unit's like close to 300 points, and they'll hit. But they're also like a really big footprint, and I think if you are running like the Stalkers, the Doomsday Ark, the King, and that unit, like you're gonna kind of have some problems with space. So that's something to consider as well. When designing your list, especially with Starshatter, is like you're running a lot of big stuff. So, if you don't have enough in reserve, it's going to be hard to fit in certain deployments, especially if you're playing like Search and Destroy or something like that. So, overall, yeah, just wanted to go over this list breakdown, and I'll definitely be trying it this week and report back probably on Thursday or Friday, and see how it feels with doing no arks. But yeah, that's it, boys.